The U.S. Perseverance drifted through space like a lost child wandering into a palace. Except this child had no idea. It was supposed to be afraid Commander Elena Vasquez stood on the bridge with her coffee cup in hand, watching the swirling lights of the unstable wormhole fade behind them. And she had to admit that accidentally falling through a hole in space was not how she had planned to spend her Tuesday. Where exactly are we? She asked her navigation officer. Lieutenant Park studied his console with the expression of a man who had just realized his maps were completely useless. Commander, I have absolutely no idea, he said. But I can tell you that we are very far from where we started. Before Vasquez could respond, the proximity alarms began screaming like angry children, and a view screen filled with ships, hundreds of them, thousands of them. More ships than anyone on the Perseverance had ever seen in one place. They were massive vessels covered in sharp angles and glowing weapons, and they surrounded the tiny human ship like wolves circling a rabbit. Well, Vasquez said, taking a sip of her coffee, this is new. The communications console crackled to life, and a face appeared on the main screen. A tall alien with scales the color of polished bronze, and eyes that burned with the confidence of someone who had never been told no. Primitive vessel, the alien announced in a voice that echoed with practiced authority. I am Grand Admiral Zethrix of the Valkyrie hegemony, and you have entered the territory of the greatest empire the galaxy has ever known. Vasquez raised an eyebrow and waited for him to continue. Admiral Zethrix seemed pleased by what he assumed was stunned silence, and he pressed a button that filled the human view screen with holographic displays. Images of conquered worlds flashed before them. Planets burning under orbital bombardment, species kneeling before Valkyrie banners, weapons capable of cracking planets like eggs, and armadas that stretched across entire star systems. For 12,000 years, the hegemony has ruled this galaxy, Zethrix declared with obvious pride. And over 400 species have learned to bow before our might. And now you will join them. The bridge of the Perseverance was quiet, but not with fear. Lieutenant Chun leaned over to Ensign Kowalski and whispered, Is it just me, or does this feel like a really aggressive sales presentation? Kowalski nodded and whispered back, I have seen scarier stuff in history class. On the screen, Zethrix was now showing footage of what he called a pacification campaign, which involved soldiers marching through alien cities while the population surrendered in terror. Dr. Marcus Webb, the ship's historian, watched with academic interest and then turned to the commander. That is actually fairly tame by historical standards, he said in a voice loud enough for the transmission to pick up. We did worse to ourselves in the 1940s, and we only had bullets and bombs back then. Zethrix paused, his expression flickering with something that might have been confusion. You dare to speak while the Grand Admiral addresses you? He demanded. Vasquez shrugged, a gesture that clearly did not translate well because Zethrix looked even more confused. My apologies, Admiral, she said in a tone that suggested she was not actually sorry at all. Please continue with your presentation. But I have to ask, do you have any coffee on your ships? We have been traveling for a while and our supplies are running low. The Admiral stared at her for a long moment, and somewhere behind him, one of his officers made a sound like a strangled cough. You ask about beverages? Zethrix said slowly, as if he could not quite believe what he was hearing. I am offering you the choice between submission and annihilation, and you ask about beverages? Well, yes, Vasquez replied. Annihilation is not really on our schedule today, and submission sounds boring. So I figured we might as well be comfortable while we figure this out. The Admiral's scales seemed to shift color slightly, which the human crew would later learn was a sign of extreme agitation. Perhaps you do not understand your situation, he said through what appeared to be clenched teeth. You are surrounded by the most powerful fleet in the known galaxy. And your single ship has no hope of escape or survival, Chief Engineer O'Brien. A large man with hands that had fixed everything from coffee makers to fusion reactors looked up from his console. Actually, Commander, their weapons are impressive, but their targeting systems look a bit outdated. And I am pretty sure our point defense could handle at least the first few volleys. He said this casually. The way someone might comment on the weather, Zethrix heard this through the still-open communication channel. And his scales shifted color again. You believe you could survive our assault? He asked, and there was something new in his voice. Something that sounded almost like uncertainty. Vasquez smiled. And it was the smile of a woman who had grown up on stories of human stubbornness, human survival, human refusal to simply lie down and die. Admiral, let me tell you something about humans, she said. Our species has survived ice ages that covered half our planet, plagues that killed 1/3 of our population, wars that burned entire continents, and weapons we invented specifically to destroy ourselves. And we are still here. She set down her coffee cup and stood up straighter. Your fleet is very pretty, and I am sure it has terrified everyone else you have met. But we come from a world where everything has been trying to kill us since before we learned to walk upright. And we have learned to be very hard to impress. The bridge of the Hegemony flagship had gone very quiet. Admiral Zethrix opened his mouth to respond. But before he could speak, a small girl appeared at the edge of the Perseverance bridge, holding a stuffed animal and looking sleepy. Mommy, she said to Lutfun and Park. I heard loud noises and I cannot sleep. Park scooped up his daughter and held her against his shoulder, rubbing her back gently while she yawned. It is okay, sweetheart, he said. Just some new people saying hello, go back to sleep. The child looked at the view screen, at the alien admiral with his bronze scales and burning eyes, and she waved at him with one small hand before closing her eyes and nestling against her father on the Hegemony flagship. Admiral Zethrix stared at this scene with an expression that his officers had never seen before. You brought children on a military vessel? He asked, and his voice had lost some of its thunder. This is not a military vessel, Vasquez said. This is an exploration ship, and we brought families because exploring the universe is not something we wanted to do alone. She picked up her coffee cup again and took another sip. Now, Admiral, I believe we were discussing shore leave, because my crew has been cooped up on this ship for months, and we could really use a chance to stretch our legs. She smiled again, warm and genuine and completely unafraid. So what do you say? Can you point us to the nearest station where we can get some supplies? Maybe see some sights? Learn about your impressive empire in a more relaxed setting? Zethrix looked at her, then at the child sleeping peacefully despite being surrounded by weapons capable of destroying worlds. Then at the crew who watched him with polite interest instead of terror. You are either the bravest species I have ever encountered, he said slowly, or the most insane. Vasquez laughed, and it was a genuine laugh. The kind that came from someone who had heard that comparison before. Admiral, in our experience, those two things are often the same. She raised her coffee cup in a small salute. So, about that shore leave? Ambassador Trix had been assigned many difficult tasks in her long career serving the Hegemony, but none had prepared her for the challenge of trying to intimidate humans. She stood at the entrance to Orbital Station Nexus 7, watching the human delegation step off their shuttle. With the casual confidence of tourists arriving at a vacation resort, they looked around at the massive station with its towering spires and armed guards and thousands of alien species hurrying about their business, and their expressions showed nothing but mild curiosity. This is nice, Commander Vasquez said, nodding approvingly at the architecture. Very shiny. Trix felt her scales ripple with frustration, a reaction she quickly suppressed, because showing emotion to subjects was considered weakness in Hegemony culture. Welcome to Nexus 7, she said in her most commanding voice. "I am Ambassador Trex, and I have been assigned to oversee your supervised freedom while the High Council decides your fate." "Supervised freedom," repeated Dr. Webb. The human historian. "Is that like being grounded, but you can still go outside?" Several of the humans laughed at this, and Trix had no idea why. "You will follow me," she said, choosing to ignore the comment. "I will show you the might of the hegemony, so that you may understand the power you face." She led them through the station with purpose, taking them first to the gladiatorial arena, where thousands of spectators watched as combatants fought for their lives in the bloody sand below. "Behold," Trix announced, gesturing at the carnage. "This is how we entertain ourselves, with blood and death and the screams of the defeated." She expected horror, disgust, perhaps some satisfying tears. Instead, Dr. Webb pulled out a small recording device and began taking notes. "Fascinating," he said with genuine academic interest. "This is remarkably similar to the Roman Colosseum, which was the center of entertainment in one of Earth's ancient empires." He turned to his colleagues with an enthusiastic expression. "The Romans used to flood the arena for naval battles, and sometimes they would release exotic animals to fight condemned prisoners. And the crowds loved it." Trix stared at him. "Your ancient people did this?" she asked. "Oh yes," Webb said cheerfully. "And that was considered civilized compared to some cultures. The Aztecs used to sacrifice thousands of people at a time to their gods, ripping out hearts while they were still beating. And medieval Europe had something called drawing and quartering that I will not describe because we are about to have lunch." The humans nodded along as if this was perfectly normal conversation. Trix felt something cold settle in her stomach, but she pressed on. She took them next to the public execution square, where a criminal was being put to death for the crime of speaking against the hegemony. "This is the fate of those who defy us," she said, trying to recapture her intimidating tone. The humans watched with solemn expressions, and for a moment, Trix thought she had finally gotten through to them. Then Ensign Kowalski leaned over to Lieutenant Chun. "At least it is quick," she whispered. "Better than what some Earth governments used to do." Chun nodded in agreement. "My grandmother told me stories about the Cultural Revolution," he said quietly. "This is nothing." Trix overheard this exchange and felt her confidence slipping further. She decided to try a different approach and led them to the Environmental Crimes Division, where she described the worst punishment the hegemony could inflict short of death. "Exile," she said dramatically, "to a Category 4 death world. Planets with extreme gravity, hostile weather, and predatory megafauna that hunt anything that moves." She pulled up holographic images of such a world, showing storms and earthquakes and massive creatures with far too many teeth. "The most terrible of these worlds has gravity of 1.3 times standard," she said, "and predators that can kill a Valkyrie warrior in seconds. No one has ever survived more than one rotation." The humans exchanged glances, and their expressions were strange, almost amused. 1.3 gravity? Asked Chief Engineer O'Brien. "That is barely noticeable." "And those predators," added Lieutenant Park, who was carrying his daughter on his shoulders. "They look like the crocodiles back home, except smaller." His daughter giggled and pointed at the holographic monster. "Puppy," she said. Hapolithrix felt her eye twitch. "You have creatures like this on your homeworld?" she demanded. "Oh, we have much worse," Vasquez said casually. "Australia alone has enough venomous animals to stock a dozen death worlds. And that is one of the places humans choose to live for fun." She smiled at Trex's expression of disbelief. "Earth is a Category 4 death world by your standards, maybe Category 5. And we have 8 billion people living there." Trex stood in stunned silence for a long moment. Then she made a decision that would either save her career or end it. "Come with me," she said. her voice no longer commanding but almost desperate. "There is something else I must show you." She led them to a memorial hall, a vast chamber filled with monuments to the hegemony's greatest shame. "This is the Hall of the Plague Wars," she said softly. 2 billion of our people died over 80 years of conflict and disease. And it nearly destroyed our civilization. She expected this. Finally, to move them, the humans did look moved. But not in the way she expected. "That is terrible," Vasquez said with genuine sympathy. "Losing so many people must have been devastating." "It was," Trex said, feeling a small victory. "It was the darkest chapter in our history." Dr. Webb nodded thoughtfully. "We understand," he said. "Earth had something similar called World War II, where 75 million people died in just 6 years. Trix felt her heart stop. 6 years? She whispered, 75 million in 6 years? Yes, and that was with primitive technology, Webb continued. Bullets and bombs and gas chambers. And we also had the Spanish flu pandemic that killed 50 million in just 2 years. And the Black Death that wiped out 1/3 of Europe in the 14th century. He said these things the way someone might recite grocery lists. Our species has been killing itself and dying from disease since we first learned to walk, he said. And somehow we always survive. We always come back. We always rebuild. Trex looked at these strange creatures. These humans who spoke of death on unimaginable scales with the casual acceptance of people who had simply learned to live with it. How? She asked, and her voice was barely a whisper. How do you survive such things and remain sane? Vasquez considered the question seriously. I am not sure we are entirely sane, she admitted. But we have learned that giving up is never an option, that no matter how dark things get, there is always a tomorrow worth fighting for. She put a gentle hand on Trix's arm, a gesture that startled the ambassador. Your plague wars sound terrible, and I am sorry your people went through that, but you survived too. And that means you understand something important about existence. Trix stared at the human commander, seeing her not as a primitive to be conquered, but as something else entirely, before she could respond. There was a commotion at the far end of the station. Lieutenant Park's daughter had wandered off and found the kennel where the station kept its execution beasts. Massive predators used to kill condemned criminals in the most horrible way possible. The guards were panicking, reaching for weapons, calling for backup, but when Trix rushed to the scene, she found the most feared creature on the station lying on its back while a human child rubbed its belly. The beast was making a sound that the translator could not identify, but the humans immediately recognized it as purring, Park said with obvious delight. She made friends with it. His daughter looked up with a brilliant smile. Can we keep him? She asked. Trix returned to her quarters that night and filed a report that she knew would change everything. URGent threat assessment. UNDEFINED humans are not what we expected. They are not primitive, and they are not afraid. They have seen worse than anything we can show them. They have survived worse than anything we can do to them. Recommend immediate reclassification from conquest. Targets to diplomatic priority. They are not our enemies, but I am not certain we could make them so even if we tried. High Inquisitor Vorn had broken the minds of thousands of prisoners in his long career, and he had read the secret histories of hundreds of species, and he believed that nothing in the galaxy could surprise him anymore. He was wrong. The humans had willingly shared their database with hegemony intelligence, which Vorn found suspicious at first, assuming it must be filled with misinformation designed to confuse their enemies. But as he began reading, he realized the truth was far more disturbing than any lies could have been. Begin with the geological history, he instructed his assistant, a young analyst named Keth, who was eager to prove herself. Keth pulled up the relevant files and began reading aloud. The planet Earth has experienced 5 major extinction events, she said, the worst of which, called the Great Dying, killed approximately 90% of all species on the planet. Vaughan nodded, as this was not unusual. Many worlds had difficult histories. Continue, he said. The humans evolved during a period of repeated ice ages, Kath said, her voice growing uncertain, during which massive sheets of ice covered large portions of their planet, and temperatures dropped to levels that would kill most known species. She paused and checked the data again. They survived this by developing tools and fire and learning to hunt the largest and most dangerous creatures on their world, including something called a mammoth that was larger than a Valkyrie battle tank. Vaughan leaned forward with interest. Show me their war history, he said. This was a mistake. The file that opened was enormous, so large that Kath had to scroll through it just to see the categories. There appeared to be thousands of conflicts recorded, she said with confusion. The database includes something called the Wikipedia list of wars, and it seems to never end. Vaughan took over the console and began reading the 100 Years' War, which actually lasted 116 years, the 30 Years' War, which killed 8 million people, the Typing Rebellion, which killed 20 million people, the First World War, which was supposed to be the war to end all wars, but was followed 20 years later by the Second World War, which was even worse. He read about trenches filled with poison gas and beaches covered with bodies and cities reduced to rubble by weapons that fell from the sky. He read about something called the Holocaust, where one group of humans systematically murdered 6 million members of another group for reasons that made no sense to him. He read about nuclear weapons, devices that could destroy entire cities in a single flash of light. And he learned that the humans had built enough of these to destroy their entire planet multiple times over. And then he learned that they had done this on purpose, mutually assured destruction. He read aloud, his voice hollow. A military strategy in which each side has enough nuclear weapons to completely destroy the other, ensuring that any nuclear attack would result in the annihilation of both parties. He sat back in his chair and stared at the screen. They deliberately created a situation where their entire species could be wiped out at any moment, he said. And they lived like this for decades. Kath was pale beneath her scales. Should I continue with the database analysis? She asked. Vaughan was not sure he wanted her to, but duty demanded it. Show me their entertainment, he said, hoping for something lighter. This was another mistake. The humans had entire categories of entertainment dedicated to frightening themselves. Horror movies showed monsters and ghosts and killers stalking innocent victims. Disaster films depicted the destruction of their cities by asteroids and earthquakes and floods. Post-apocalyptic stories imagined their civilization destroyed by war or plague or environmental collapse. And these were among their most popular forms of fiction. They enjoy this, Kath said with disbelief. They watch simulations of their own extinction for pleasure. Vaughan found something called a roller coaster, which was a machine specifically designed to create feelings of terror and falling. And humans paid money to ride these things voluntarily. He found haunted houses, where humans paid to have actors frighten them in dark corridors. He found extreme sports, where humans jumped out of perfectly functional aircraft or climbed dangerous mountains or swam with predators. All for fun. This species is insane, Kath whispered. Vaughan was about to agree when he found something that disturbed him more than anything else. It was a collection of videos from something called the Cold War, a period when the humans lived under constant threat of nuclear annihilation. The videos were educational materials designed to teach children what to do in the event of a nuclear attack. He watched a cartoon character named Bert the turtle demonstrate how to duck and cover under a desk. When the bombs fell, he listened to calm narrators explain the effects of radiation poisoning in clinical detail. He saw automated systems counting down to potential annihilation, with mechanical voices announcing the minutes until possible extinction. And the humans had shown these videos to their children. They had raised entire generations, knowing that at any moment, without warning, their world could end in fire. And those generations had grown up and had children of their own and built civilizations and created art and fallen in love and dreamed of the stars, all while living under the shadow of instant death. Vorn closed the database and sat in silence for a long time. High Inquisitor, Keth said nervously, "What should I include in the report?" Vorn laughed, and it was not a pleasant sound. "Include everything," he said. "Include the wars and the plagues and the extinction events and the nuclear weapons and the horror movies and the roller coasters." He stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. "Include the fact that this species has been trying to kill itself since before it achieved civilization, and it has not succeeded yet." He turned back to his assistant with haunted eyes. "Include the fact that we have been trying to intimidate a species that grew up with the end of the world as a daily possibility." He laughed again, and this time there was something like respect in it. "We have been showing them our weapons and our conquests, thinking we could frighten them into submission." He shook his head slowly. "We might as well try to frighten the darkness itself." Keth finished the report and sent it to the High Council. And within hours, the entire intelligence division was in chaos. Officers who had read the human database were requesting leave, some of them showing signs of psychological distress. One analyst had locked herself in her quarters and refused to come out, muttering about something called trench warfare and mustard gas. Another had become obsessed with a human conflict called the Siege of Leningrad, where humans had eaten leather and glue to survive for 900 days rather than surrender. The head of psychological operations had simply resigned, leaving a note that said he could not in good conscience try to break beings who had already survived everything the universe could throw at them. Vorn himself took a personal leave day. Then another. He was eventually found in the station counseling center, rocking gently in a chair while a therapist tried to help him process what he had learned. They called it MAD. He kept saying, "mutually assured destruction." And they kept the weapons anyway, and they had children anyway, and they fell in love anyway. He looked up at the therapist with something like awe. What kind of species looks at the end of everything and decides to keep living anyway? The therapist had no answer, but 2 days later, the High Council received a briefing that would change the hegemony's approach to humanity forever. Priority classification. Existential. The human species cannot be conquered through fear. They have experienced fear beyond anything we can create. They have survived horrors beyond anything we can imagine. They have looked into the void of their own extinction and chosen to keep existing out of sheer stubbornness. Recommend immediate cessation of intimidation protocols. Recommend reclassification from primitive newcomers to potential existential threat. Recommend extreme caution in all future dealings. These beings are not afraid of death. They have been living with it as a companion since before they learned to write. We cannot break what is already unbreakable. The council read the report in silence, and for the first time in 12,000 years, they began to consider the possibility that there were some species that could not be conquered, not because they were stronger, but because they simply refused to stop surviving. The Hegemony High Council had ruled the galaxy for 12,000 years by following one simple principle, which was that every species could be broken if you found the right pressure points. Some species feared death, so you threatened to kill them. Some species feared pain, so you hurt them until they submitted. Some species feared the loss of their homes or their families or their histories, so you threatened to take those things away. But humans did not seem to fear anything the council could identify. And this was unacceptable. "We will put them through the trials," declared Supreme Chancellor Varaxis, the oldest and most powerful member of the council. "Every species has a weakness, and the trials will find it." The trials were legendary throughout the galaxy, a series of tests designed to break the spirit of any being. And no species had ever completed them without surrendering. The humans were brought to the tribunal chamber, a vast arena surrounded by thousands of observers from across the hegemony who had come to watch these strange newcomers finally learn their place. Commander Vasquez stood at the front of her delegation, looking around at the massive chamber with the expression of someone admiring interesting architecture. "This is very dramatic," she said approvingly. "I like the lighting." Chancellor Varaxis rose from his throne with ancient dignity. "Humans," he announced in a voice that echoed through the chamber, "you have been granted the honor of the trials, through which you will demonstrate your worthiness to join the hegemony, or prove yourselves too weak to deserve continued existence." He gestured toward a doorway that glowed with ominous red light. "The first trial is the Chamber of Fears, where you will face the deepest terrors of your subconscious mind. And no species has ever emerged unchanged." Vasquez looked at her crew. "Any volunteers?" She asked. Chief Engineer O'Brien shrugged and stepped forward. "I could use a bit of excitement," he said. He walked through the doorway and disappeared into the red light. And the chamber fell silent as everyone waited inside the Chamber of Fears. O'Brien found himself standing in darkness as shapes began to form around him. Nightmares pulled from the deepest parts of his mind. He saw his childhood home burning. While his parents screamed for help, he saw himself drowning in black water while something massive moved beneath him. He saw doctor telling him his children had died in an accident. While he was away, the images were vivid and terrible, designed to trigger primal panic responses in any sentient being. O'Brien stood in the middle of it all and took a deep breath. Right then, he said to himself, "Let us get through this." He had grown up in Dublin during some of the hardest years his country had known, and he had lost friends to violence and poverty and despair. And he had learned that fear was just another thing you had to live with. He walked through the nightmares like a man walking through a storm, acknowledging the terror but refusing to let it control him. When he emerged from the chamber 15 minutes later, the observers gasped. "How do you feel?" Varaxis de Mandabrian considered the question. "Bit spooky," he admitted. "Reminded me of this haunted house back in Dublin that my wife dragged me to last Halloween. Except that one had better special effects." He turned to Vasquez. "The fake spider jumping out got me a little, but otherwise not bad." The chamber erupted in confused murmuring. Varaxis silenced them with a gesture and pointed to a second doorway, this one glowing with white light. "The second trial is the threshold of pain," he said. "You will be subjected to increasing levels of physical suffering until you beg for mercy. And no species has ever passed." Level 3. Gunnery Sergeant Torres stepped forward. Before anyone could ask for volunteers, "I have been curious about this one," she said. She entered the chamber and was strapped into a device that looked like a medical nightmare, covered in sensors and electrodes and things that were clearly designed to cause suffering. The pain began at level 1, which was considered unbearable by most species. Torres felt fire running through her nerves and gritted her teeth. Level 2 felt like her bones were being crushed, while acid poured through her veins. She screamed but did not ask for mercy. Level 3 was supposed to be impossible. Pain so intense that the mind could not process it without breaking. Torres endured it with her eyes squeezed shut and her hands clenched into fists. She passed level 4, then level 5, then level 6. The technicians monitoring the device began to look frightened at level 7. Torres finally spoke. "Is that all?" She gasped through the pain. "Because I have experienced worse." The technician stopped the device. Not because Torres surrendered, but because they were afraid of what would happen if they continued. Torres walked out of the chamber on shaking legs, but with her head held high. What could possibly be worse than that? Varaxis demanded. Torres met his eyes steadily. Childbirth, she said. I have 3 kids. And that machine is nothing compared to 30 hours of labor with my first one. She smiled. And it was the smile of someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side. Also, I broke my leg once and had to set it myself because I was alone in the wilderness. And another time I got shot in the shoulder and still finished the mission. She shrugged. Pain is just information, Chancellor. And humans have learned to process a lot of information. The chamber was absolutely silent. Varaxis looked at his fellow counselors, and for the first time in anyone's memory, he seemed uncertain. The 3rd trial, he said, and his voice had lost some of its commanding power. Is combat. A massive warrior emerged from the shadows. A Kreth soldier standing 8 feet tall and covered in armor that had never been breached in battle. This is Champion Korath, Varaxis said. Undefeated in 3,000 fights, destroyer of armies, terror of the eastern sectors. Torres looked at Vasquez. May I? She asked. Vasquez nodded. Torres walked into the arena facing the massive champion, who looked down at her with contempt. You are small, Korath rumbled. This will be quick. Torres smiled. You are slow, she replied. This will be quicker. Korath roared and charged at her with his massive arms swinging. Torres moved like water, sliding under his attack and striking at the gaps in his armor with precise, devastating blows. The champion stumbled, confused by an opponent who did not fight with strength, but with speed and precision and an understanding of anatomy that let her find every weakness in his defenses. The fight lasted 11 seconds. Korath fell to his knees with his armor cracked and his body failing him. And Torres stood over him with her fist raised for a final blow. Then she lowered her hand and stepped back. I do not need to kill you, she said. You fought well, and I respect that. She offered him her hand. And after a long moment of shock, Korath took it and let her help him to his feet. You are strong, he said with genuine admiration. Stronger than anyone I have faced. No, Torres said. I am just trained. And humans have been fighting each other for a very long time. So we have gotten very good at it. Chancellor Varaxis descended from his throne and approached the humans with slow, deliberate steps. We have one final demonstration, he said. Not a trial, but a truth. He led them to a chamber deep beneath the arena, where something massive hummed with terrible power. This is the Void Bomb, he said. A weapon capable of erasing an entire solar system from existence. The ultimate expression of hegemony power. He expected fear, awe, perhaps worship. The humans were quiet, looking at the weapon with expressions that were hard to read. Finally, Vasquez spoke. We built something like that once, she said softly. Well, several times actually. Varaxis stared at her. You possess such weapons? He asked. We still do, Vasquez said. We call them nuclear weapons. And at our peak we had enough of them to destroy our planet several times over. She looked at the Void Bomb with something like sadness. The scary part is not the weapon, Chancellor. The scary part is that we seriously considered using them on each other. And the only thing that stopped us was the knowledge that we would destroy ourselves in the process. She turned to face him directly. You think this weapon makes you powerful. But let me tell you something about true power. Her voice was steady and calm. True power is building a weapon that can end everything, and then choosing not to use it. True power is looking at annihilation and deciding that life is worth more than victory. She gestured at her crew, at the families and scientists and explorers who had come with her across the stars. We have stood on the edge of extinction by our own hands, and we stepped back. And that is harder than any conquest. Varaxis was silent for a long moment. Then he asked the question that had been haunting the council since the humans arrived. What does frighten you? He asked, what do humans fear? Vasquez thought about it seriously. We fear losing each other, she said. We fear being alone in the universe. We fear that our children might inherit a worse world than we did. She smiled softly. We fear the ordinary tragedies. Chancellor, losing the people we love, watching our dreams fade, growing old with regrets. She looked up at the vast aliens standing before her. But death and pain and destruction? We have lived with those for so long that they are just part of existence. And you cannot threaten someone with things they have already survived. The chamber was silent as her words echoed through the stone. Everaxis turned to his council, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that everything they thought they knew was wrong. Leave us, he said to the humans. We must discuss what we have learned. 1 year had passed since the humans stumbled through a wormhole and accidentally changed the galaxy forever. The hegemony had quietly reclassified humanity, not as subjects to be conquered, not as enemies to be destroyed, but as neighbors to be respected and carefully observed. Trade agreements had been signed. Cultural exchanges had begun, and for the first time in 12,000 years, the hegemony was learning to deal with the species as equals. Rather than subordinates, it had not been easy. The first screening of a human horror movie at a cultural exchange event had caused 17 psychological breakdowns among the alien audience, and one particularly sensitive diplomat had apparently converted to something called the cult of the chainsaw before his colleagues could explain that the movie was not a religious text. Human music had proven equally challenging, with many species finding the emotional intensity overwhelming, though a surprising number had become devoted fans of something called heavy metal, which they described as finally a species that understands screaming. Ambassador Vasquez sat in her new office on Nexus 7, preparing for a meeting that she had been anticipating for months. The door opened and Admiral Zethrix walked in. Though he was no longer called Grand Admiral, having been demoted after his failure to subdue the humans through intimidation, he looked older than he had a year ago. As if the weight of everything he had learned had aged him. Ambassador, he said formally. Admiral, Vasquez replied. Please sit down. Zethrix settled into a chair across from her desk, and for a long moment they simply looked at each other. I still do not understand, he finally said. We showed you our might, our weapons, our empire built on the bones of 400 species, and you were not afraid. Vasquez considered her response carefully. Let me ask you something, she said. When you were young, before you joined the military, what scared you? Zethrix was surprised by the question. The usual things, he said slowly. Failure, disappointment. The thought that I might not live up to my family's expectations. Vasquez nodded. Those are personal fears. Things that matter because they are connected to who you are and what you care about. She leaned forward. Now think about the threats your empire uses. Death, pain, destruction, the annihilation of worlds. These are big and personal things, and they are terrifying to species who have never faced them before. She gestured at herself. But humans grew up on a world that was trying to kill us from the beginning. And we have been killing each other for as long as we have existed. And we have looked at the end of everything and decided to keep going anyway. She smiled softly. Your threats were not personal, Admiral. They were just more of the same, and we have built up a very high tolerance for that kind of thing. Zethrix absorbed this. Then what would threaten you? He asked. What would make humans surrender? Honestly, I do not know if anything could make us surrender, Vasquez said. We have a saying on Earth, give me liberty or give me death. And the people who said that meant it literally. She thought for a moment. But that does not mean we cannot be reasoned with. We are stubborn, not stupid. And we would much rather make friends than enemies. She extended her hand across the desk. That is why I asked for this meeting, Admiral. Because I think it is time for our peoples to stop circling each other and start actually talking. Zithrix looked at the extended hand, remembering the briefings he had read about human customs. A handshake, an ancient gesture meant to show that you carried no weapons with humans, he suspected. The absence of visible weapons meant very little, but he took her hand anyway. What do humans want from the galaxy? He asked as they shook. Vasquez grinned, and it was the same grin her ancestors had worn when they first figured out how to make fire. When they first built boats to cross the ocean. When they first looked up at the moon and decided that they wanted to walk on it. Same thing we have always wanted, she said. To see what is out there, to survive, to thrive. Her grin softened into something warmer, and maybe, if we are lucky, to make some friends along the way. Zithrix found himself smiling back. Something he had not done genuinely in a very long time. The hegemony has never had friends, he admitted. We have had subjects and enemies and neutral parties, but never friends. Then, maybe it is time to try something new, Vasquez said. You have been doing the same thing for 12,000 years, and I am sure it has worked well enough. But the galaxy is changing. She stood and walked to the window, looking out at the stars. There are more humans coming, Admiral. Our exploration ships have found the wormhole network, and we are spreading out across the galaxy. And in a few generations, there will be millions of us. Then billions. She turned back to face him. You can try to conquer us, and we will fight you with everything we have. And it will be bloody and terrible, and neither side will truly win. Her expression was serious, but not threatening. Or you can work with us. Trade with us. Share knowledge and culture and ideas. And maybe together we can build something better than either of us could build alone. Zithrix stood and joined her at the window. The council is divided, he said quietly. Some believe we should strike now, before your numbers grow too large. Before you become a true threat. And what do you believe? Vasquez asked. Zithrix was silent for a long moment, watching a human cargo ship drift past the station, its crew visible through the windows, laughing and talking as they went about their work. I believe that we have spent 12,000 years conquering and controlling, he said. And we have built something powerful but not something good. He looked at Vasquez with an expression she had not seen from any hegemony official before. Something that looked almost like hope. I believe that maybe it is time to try building something good. Vasquez smiled and put a hand on his arm. A gesture of friendship that a year ago would have been unthinkable. Then let us start building, she said, far across the galaxy. In a region of space so distant that light from the hegemony's core worlds would take 1,000 years to reach it. Something ancient stirred. The Watchers had been dormant for longer than most civilizations had existed, sleeping in the spaces between stars, waiting for something worth waking for. A signal reached them, carried on waves that had traveled for months across the void. It was human music. A symphony of sound that was chaotic and emotional and impossibly alive, full of joy and sorrow and defiance and hope. The Watchers listened, they analyzed. They remembered other species they had encountered over the millions of years of their existence. Species that had burned bright and faded. Species that had conquered and collapsed. Species that had looked at the universe and decided it was too vast and cold and indifferent to bother with. But this music was different. This music was created by beings who had looked at the cold, indifferent universe and decided to fill. It would sound anyway. This music was defiant in a way the Watchers had rarely encountered. Not the defiance of anger or hatred, but the defiance of hope. The insistence that existence was worth celebrating, even when everything suggested otherwise. The Watchers began to wake. Old systems coming online for the first time in eons. sensors reaching out across the galaxy to learn more about these strange new beings. They were very curious, and in her office on Nexus 7, Ambassador Vasquez felt something, a shiver that ran down her spine. The sense that somewhere, somehow, something important had just happened. She looked out at the stars and smiled. "We are not alone," she whispered to herself. "We've never been alone, and maybe that is the point." She thought about everything humans had survived. The ice ages and plagues and wars, the nuclear standoffs and environmental disasters, and all the ordinary tragedies of daily life. They had survived it all because they had never stopped believing that tomorrow was worth fighting for, and now they were here among the stars, making friends with former enemies and spreading their music into the void, whatever came next. Whatever ancient beings stirred in the darkness, whatever challenges the universe threw at them, humans would face it the same way they had faced everything else, together, stubbornly, with hope in their hearts and songs on their lips, because that was what humans did. They survived, they refused to give up, and they dragged everyone else along with them. Whether they liked it or not, the galaxy would never be the same. But then again, that was the point. Humans did not adapt to the universe. They made the universe adapt to them, and somewhere in the void, the Watchers watched and waited, and wondered what these impossible creatures would do next. They had a feeling it was going to be interesting.